The neon glow of Rosie's diner flickered like a lighthouse in the vast darkness of the open road. A relic of the past, it stood alone, its polished chrome counters and red leather booths whispering tales of an era long gone. The distant hum of a jukebox filled the air, playing an old Johnny Cash tune, blending with the comforting sizzle of bacon on the grill. Through the glass doors, Big Shaq stepped inside, a towering figure of raw power, his broad shoulders barely squeezing through the doorway. His presence alone sent an unspoken ripple through the room. He didn't need to announce himself. Clad in a gray hoodie, his hands tucked in the front pocket, Shaq exuded the quiet confidence of a man who had seen his fair share of fights and walked away, standing. The waitress, a young woman with tired eyes, hesitated for a split second before forcing a smile. "Welcome to Rosie's. What can I get you?" Shaq slid into the booth nearest to the window, his back against the wall. A position of habit, not coincidence. Steak, rare, and coffee. His deep voice rumbled, steady and sure. As he picked up a menu, the door swung open violently. A sharp gust of wind blew through, but the sudden chill had nothing to do with the weather. A gang of bikers stormed in, their leather jackets slick from the rain, their eyes scanning the room like wolves searching for prey. And Big Shaq? He just kept flipping through the menu, but he already knew. Trouble had just walked in. Big Shaq faces the Hellhounds. Trouble finds him. The door slammed against the wall, rattling the windows of Rosie's diner. The low murmur of conversation died instantly. Even the jukebox, as if sensing the shift in atmosphere, skipped a beat before resuming its slow, haunting tune. The air inside the diner turned thick, like the heavy stillness before a storm. They had arrived. A gang of bikers stormed in, their leather jackets soaked from the rain, their boots clanking heavily against the linoleum floor. Their insignia, a snarling wolf with blood-red eyes, gleamed under the diner's fluorescent lights. The Hellhounds, notorious, dangerous. The kind of men who didn't just start fights, they finished them. At the center of the pack stood Razor, their leader, a man whose face bore the scars of 100 bar brawls. His cold, steel-gray eyes scanned the room like a predator surveying its territory. Then, they locked onto Big Shaq, sitting alone in the corner booth, cool as ever, still flipping through the menu like nothing had happened. Razor's lip curled into a smirk. "Well, well, look what we got here." His voice was thick with contempt, loud enough to make sure everyone heard him. "A big boy, sitting pretty all by himself. Didn't your mama teach you to respect the locals?" Shaq didn't even glance up. He casually turned the page of the menu, his fingers moving slowly, deliberately. "Didn't see your name on the seat," Shaq finally said, his deep voice cutting through the silence like a knife. A few customers exchanged nervous glances. They knew where this was heading. The waitress, her hands trembling, instinctively took a step back. A trucker in the far corner of the diner swallowed hard, suddenly finding his half-eaten burger less interesting. Razor chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "Oh, he's got a mouth on him, boys." The rest of the Hellhounds laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laughter you'd hear among friends. It was the sound of men who enjoyed breaking things, bones included. One of the bikers, a tattooed brute named Slug, stepped forward, slamming a fist onto Shaq's table, causing his coffee cup to rattle. "You're sitting in Razor's booth, big man. That means you got two choices. You move, or we move you." Shaq finally set the menu down, slowly, deliberately. He lifted his gaze, his dark eyes meeting Razor's, without an ounce of fear. The diner felt smaller, tighter, like the walls had just closed in. The silence stretched, the tension thick enough to cut with a dull knife. Then, Shaq spoke, his words steady, unshaken. "I don't want trouble." For a brief moment, there was stillness. Then, crash! Slug grabbed Shaq's plate and smashed it onto the floor, sending steak and mashed potatoes flying across the diner. The sound echoed through the room like a gunshot. A waitress let out a small gasp. Someone in the back muttered, "Oh, hell no." Big Shaq didn't flinch. He just exhaled. Slow, controlled. But something in the air had changed. His fingers tightened around the edge of the table. His shoulders tensed ever so slightly. The kind of shift only a trained fighter would notice. Razor saw it too, and he liked it. "What's the matter, big man?" Razor sneered, stepping closer. "You mad?" The gang erupted into laughter. But this time, there was something off about it, because even they could feel it. The shift. Like standing on train tracks and realizing too late that the ground is rumbling beneath your feet. The waitress grabbed a notepad and scribbled something frantically before sliding it onto the counter in front of Shaq. It was barely legible, written in shaky handwriting. "Please don't fight." Shaq glanced at it. Then he looked up at the gang. A slow smirk spread across his face. "You shouldn't have done that." To be continued. What happens next? Will Big Shaq walk away? Or will the Hellhounds regret ever stepping into Rosie's diner? Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you're ready for the next part. If you think Big Shaq is about to teach these punks a lesson, hit like. Comment round 2 if you want to see the next fight. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this showdown. The diner held its breath. The shattered plate lay scattered across the checkered floor, remnants of steak and mashed potatoes smeared like battle scars on the tile. The Hellhounds grinned, their leader Razor standing tall, confident, reveling in the tension thickening the air. Big Shaq sat still, unshaken, his broad shoulders relaxed, his fists motionless. But his eyes? His eyes told a different story. For a moment, the world outside seemed distant. The neon glow of the diner sign reflecting off the rain-slick pavement, the distant rumble of an 18-wheeler rolling down the highway. Inside, though, everything was silent. No one dared move. The waitress had backed against the counter, her hands gripping a coffee pot so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, Razor leaned in, close enough that Shaq could smell the cheap whiskey on his breath. "You didn't hear me, huh?" His voice was barely above a whisper. "I said, crack!" The words never finished. Like a bolt of lightning splitting the sky, Big Shaq moved. His fist shot forward, burying itself deep in Razor's ribs. The impact was immediate, a sickening thud, as Razor's breath left him in a violent gasp. His boots scraped against the floor as he stumbled backward, eyes wide, face twisted in shock. The Hellhounds didn't have time to process it. Bam! A second biker lunged, but Shaq was already on him. A right hook, clean, precise, devastating. The man's head snapped sideways before his body followed, collapsing against a booth with a force that rattled the salt and pepper shakers off the table. Then, chaos erupted. Chairs screeched against the floor as the remaining bikers surged forward, their movements fueled by instinct and rage. Big Shaq was ready. A punch came from his left, he ducked. A stool swung from his right, he sidestepped. In one swift motion, he grabbed the stool midair and sent it crashing into its wielder's chest, knocking the man flat on his back. Another biker, Slug, the brute who had shattered Shaq's plate, roared and charged, swinging a massive fist. Shaq caught it. The sheer size of his palm swallowed Slug's fist whole. There was a second of disbelief on Slug's face before Shaq twisted his arm, forcing him onto his knees. Then, thud. A downward elbow to the back of the neck, and Slug hit the ground like a sack of bricks. The fight was a storm, fast, brutal, unrelenting. Shaq moved like a machine, each blow landing with surgical precision. One by one, the Hellhounds fell. A rib cracked here, a jaw shattered there. The diner became a battlefield, tables overturned, glass crunching under heavy boots. Razor, still struggling to regain his breath, pulled himself up, rage burning in his eyes. Blood trickled from his mouth as he reached for something tucked in his belt, a switchblade. Shaq saw it. He didn't hesitate. Razor lunged, the blade glinting under the dim diner lights. But Shaq was faster. He sidestepped, grabbed Razor's wrist, and twisted. A sharp yelp of pain escaped the biker's throat as the knife clattered to the floor. Then came the final blow, a single, devastating uppercut. It connected square with Razor's jaw, sending him airborne before crashing onto a booth, splintering the wooden frame beneath him. And just like that, it was over. The diner was silent again, except for the sound of heavy breathing and the occasional groan from the fallen Hellhounds. Shaq stood amidst the wreckage, exhaling slowly, rolling his shoulders like a man shaking off the weight of something insignificant. He glanced down at Razor, who lay sprawled, dazed, his gang unconscious, or moaning around him. Shaq didn't gloat. He didn't have to. With a deep breath, he stepped over the wreckage, grabbed a napkin, and wiped the blood off his knuckles. Then, he sat back down in his booth. "Waitress," he called out, voice calm, controlled. "I need a new steak." The air inside Rosie's diner was thick with tension, the smell of spilled coffee and sweat lingering in the aftermath of the brawl. Bodies lay scattered across the floor, bikers groaning in pain, booths overturned, broken glass crunching under Big Shaq's boots as he adjusted his seat. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders, unfazed by the wreckage around him. The waitress, still frozen by the counter, stared at him with wide, disbelieving eyes. Shaq simply nodded. That steak coming or what? Before she could answer, the low growl of engines rumbled in the distance. The sound cut through the diner like a warning, like a storm rolling in. More were coming. The trucker in the corner swallowed hard. "Hellhounds don't take kindly to losing, man." His voice was barely above a whisper. Shaq sighed. He had hoped to finish his meal in peace. But peace, it seemed, wasn't on the menu tonight. The headlights hit the diner first, bright and blinding against the rain-slicked pavement. The unmistakable roar of Harley-Davidsons grew louder. Then came the screeching of tires, the slamming of doors, the heavy stomp of boots hitting the asphalt. Shaq turned his head slightly, just enough to see them through the window. At least 14 of them. Bigger, meaner, more dangerous. And at the center of them, barely able to stand, was Razor. His face battered, his pride shattered, but his fury burning hotter than ever. He spat blood onto the pavement and pointed a trembling finger at the diner. "Get him!" The Hellhounds didn't hesitate. Boom! The door exploded open, slamming against the wall so hard the glass cracked. The waitress let out a sharp gasp, backing away as the gang stormed in. A tidal wave of leather, chains, and bad intentions. Shaq, still seated, barely glanced at them. He reached for his coffee, took a slow sip. Then, placing the mug down, he let out a deep sigh. "You boys really don't learn, do you?" Razor sneered. "You got lucky, big man. But let's see how you do when the odds aren't in your favor." The Hellhounds spread out, blocking every exit. The diner shrank, the walls closing in with the weight of impending violence. A bald biker with a crowbar smirked. "I think it's time we teach you some respect." Shaq's fingers drummed against the table. He cracked his neck to one side, then the other. And then, slowly, he stood up. The room shrank even more. The gang expected fear, panic. They got neither. Shaq rolled his wrists, his gaze sweeping across the pack of men now surrounding him. "All of you?" His voice was calm, almost disappointed. The Hellhounds hesitated, just for a second. And in that second, Shaq struck. He moved like a force of nature, a whirlwind of fists, elbows, and sheer unstoppable power. Bam! The first biker barely had time to react before Shaq's left hook crashed into his jaw, sending him airborne before landing face first onto a table. Crack! A second man swung a chain. Shaq caught it midair, yanked him forward, and drove a knee straight into his gut. The biker folded like a cheap lawn chair. Another rushed in with a knife. Shaq sidestepped, grabbed his wrist, and with a sickening snap, disarmed him. One punch later, and he was out cold. The diner was pure chaos. The jukebox flickered, its tune drowned out by the sounds of fists meeting flesh, bodies crashing into tables, and the groans of men realizing they had made a terrible mistake. But Razor, he wasn't done. From the doorway, he pulled something from his jacket, a sawed-off shotgun. The moment stretched. The bikers, still standing, backed away, watching their leader with wary eyes. The waitress gasped. Shaq turned, his eyes locked on the gun. No fear, no hesitation. Razor smirked. His finger tightened on the trigger. Then, the diner had become a battlefield, the air thick with the scent of sweat, spilled coffee, and the metallic tang of blood. Broken chairs, shattered plates, and unconscious bodies littered the floor. The hellhounds who had dared to challenge Big Shaq lay groaning, twitching, or knocked out cold. But none of that mattered now, because at the front of the diner, standing tall despite his battered face and swollen jaw, Razor held a sawed-off shotgun, its barrel aimed directly at Shaq's chest. For the first time that night, everything stopped. The waitress, still clutching the coffee pot, barely breathed. The trucker in the corner, who had seen his fair share of bar fights, knew this wasn't a fight anymore. This was something else entirely. Shaq, standing amidst the wreckage, wiped a streak of blood from his brow. He didn't flinch, didn't move. He just stared. Razor's lips curled into a sneer, his grip on the shotgun steady despite the tremor in his busted-up fingers. "Bet you don't feel so tough now, huh?" he rasped, spitting a glob of blood onto the floor. Shaq didn't answer. He just watched, his breathing slow and controlled, his stance relaxed. But his eyes? His eyes told a different story. The hellhounds, who were still conscious, staggered to their feet, emboldened by the sight of their leader holding all the power. They circled around Shaq once more, their confidence creeping back into their bruised bodies. Shaq exhaled through his nose. His voice was calm, cold. "You gonna shoot me, or are you just here to talk?" The words hit Razor like a slap. His finger twitched against the trigger. The tension in the room tightened like a noose. Then, he moved. Razor pulled the trigger. Boom! The blast roared through the diner like a thunderclap, shattering what little glass remained intact. Smoke filled the air, the acrid scent of gunpowder choking the room. But Shaq wasn't there. He had moved before the shot was fired, ducking low, pivoting with lightning speed. The blast tore through an empty booth, wood splintering as the hellhounds scrambled back in shock. Before Razor could react, Shaq was on him. A single brutal punch. It landed clean on Razor's wrist. Crack! Sending the shotgun spinning from his grasp. The weapon clattered to the floor, sliding under a booth. Razor barely had time to process his mistake before Shaq's fist buried itself into his ribs. The force of the blow sent him crashing against the counter, knocking over an entire stack of plates. He gasped, doubling over, his lungs refusing to cooperate. But Shaq wasn't done. Grabbing Razor by his jacket, he hoisted him up with terrifying ease. Then came the knockout punch. A straight right, pure, unfiltered power. It connected with Razor's jaw like a freight train. His head snapped back, his body lifted clean off the ground before crashing through the counter in a heap of shattered wood and broken glass. Silence. Absolute silence. The remaining hellhounds froze, their leader a crumpled heap at Shaq's feet. Not one of them dared move. Shaq took a step back, exhaling slowly, shaking the tension from his hands. He rolled his neck, the quiet crack of his joints the only sound in the diner. Then he turned to the remaining bikers. His voice was calm, almost bored. Anyone else? No one spoke. No one even breathed. Then, slowly, they moved. One by one, they backed away, grabbing their fallen leader and dragging him toward the door. Not a single one dared meet Shaq's eyes. The waitress finally let out the breath she had been holding. The trucker muttered a low curse, shaking his head in disbelief. And Shaq? He walked back to his booth, picked up a fork from the floor, and sat down. "Waitress," he called, casual as ever. "Let's try this again. I'll take that steak now." The diner sat in eerie silence. The only sounds left were the distant hum of the jukebox and the soft clinking of broken glass being shifted under heavy boots. Razor was out cold, his gang dragging his battered body toward the door. The once feared hellhounds had been reduced to a pile of moaning bodies and bruised egos. Big Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders as he settled back into his seat. He picked up the fork that had survived the chaos, tapping it against the table. "That steak ain't gonna cook itself." The waitress, still wide-eyed and pale, took a shaky breath before nodding and hurrying toward the kitchen. The storm was over. Or so everyone thought. Then came the sound. The deep, throaty growl of engines outside. Not one, not two, but many. The trucker in the corner froze mid-bite, his face draining of color. A waitress gasped, clutching the counter for support. Shaq's eyes flicked toward the window where dozens of headlights pierced through the night. their beams slicing across the rain-soaked pavement like the eyes of hungry predators. The Hellhounds weren't done, and they brought backup. Razor, barely conscious as his men dragged him out the door, managed a bloody grin. He spat a mix of saliva and blood onto the floor and croaked, "You ain't walking out of here alive, big man." Shaq exhaled through his nose, slow and measured. He wasn't surprised. He knew men like Razor, men who couldn't handle defeat. More doors slammed outside, more boots crunched against wet pavement. 15, number 20. A swarm of leather and metal had gathered outside the diner, their silhouettes towering under the neon glow of Rosie's diner sign. Some clutched tire irons. Others had chains wrapped around their fists. A few, the real dangerous ones, had knives glinting under the streetlights. The din of engines roared as the newcomers revved their bikes, sending vibrations through the very walls of the diner. One of the remaining hellhounds inside chuckled through a bloody mouth. "Looks like this ain't your night, tough guy." Shaq didn't even glance at him. He just stood up, slowly, deliberately. The man closest to him instinctively took a step back, his confidence faltering for a split second. He had seen what Big Shaq could do to a room full of men. Now Shaq turned to the trucker. "You got a back exit?" The trucker hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, but it won't matter. These guys, they're like a pack of wolves, man. They won't stop." Shaq cracked his knuckles. "I'm counting on that." The door to the diner swung open again. A massive figure stepped inside, his soaked leather jacket dripping onto the tile floor. A new challenger. A scar ran down the length of his face, splitting his lip into a permanent sneer. His knuckles were wrapped in tape, already bruised from too many fights to count. The room tensed. Shaq's eyes narrowed. The man smirked. "You're in our town now, big guy, and we don't like outsiders." The door behind him slammed shut. The Hellhounds had him trapped. To be continued. What happens next? Will Big Shaq take them all down? Or will the Hellhounds finally get the upper hand? Drop a fire emoji in the comments if you're ready for part 7. Hit like if you think Big Shaq is about to shut them down for good. Comment round 3 if you want to see the next fight. Subscribe now, because trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The door slammed shut behind the towering biker, sealing Big Shaq inside Rosie's diner with a pack of wolves. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, blood, and motor oil. The Hellhounds stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of leather, scars, and bad intentions. The man who had just entered, Grady the Butcher Malone, wasn't just another biker. He was the enforcer, the one Razor called when things needed to be handled permanently. Scarred knuckles. A stare like death itself. The kind of guy who didn't just win fights, he ended them. Grady rolled his neck, the sound of popping joints cutting through the silence like distant gunfire. He gave Shaq a once-over and smirked. "Heard you got a mean punch, big man. Guess we'll see if you can take one too." Shaq didn't blink, didn't move. He just shifted his weight slightly, positioning himself near the overturned tables, a battlefield strategist, already planning the next move. Grady cracked his knuckles and lunged. Bam! A thunderous right hook, fast, brutal, aimed to end the fight in one blow. Shaq dodged, just barely. The wind off the punch brushed his cheek like a whip. The force alone shattered the napkin dispenser behind him, sending metal shards flying. Grady wasn't just big, he was fast. The room erupted. The Hellhounds swarmed, weapons raised, fists clenched. Shaq moved like a hurricane, sidestepping, weaving, countering. Crack! A vicious elbow sent one biker crumbling to the floor. Thud! A brutal knee to the ribs took down another. Then Grady struck again. A brutal haymaker caught Shaq's ribs, staggering him for the first time all night. The force sent him skidding backward, his boots dragging against the diner floor. The Hellhounds roared. They thought they had him. Grady grinned, sensing blood. "Not so tough now, huh?" Shaq straightened, rolled his shoulders, exhaled. Then, with terrifying speed, he was on Grady. His left fist buried itself deep into Grady's stomach, folding him in half. Before Grady could react, Shaq grabbed the back of his head and drove a knee straight into his face. Crack! Blood sprayed across the counter. Grady stumbled, dazed, before Shaq delivered the final blow, a savage uppercut that lifted him off his feet and sent him crashing into a booth, unconscious before he landed. Silence. Every biker still standing froze. Their enforcer, their best fighter, gone in under 20 seconds. Shaq turned to the remaining Hellhounds, his breath steady, his gaze unreadable. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. One by one, they backed away. Then, without a second glance, they bolted, scrambling over each other in their desperation to escape. Shaq wiped his knuckles on his hoodie, stepping over Grady's motionless body. He grabbed a stool, pulled it back to his booth, and sat down. The waitress, hands trembling, cautiously walked up. You still want that steak? Shaq smirked. Yeah, make it two? The Hellhounds had scattered like roaches when the light hit, their once unshakable confidence shattered by one man. The diner, once filled with chaos, was now eerily silent. Only the low hum of the neon sign outside and the occasional groan of an unconscious biker reminded everyone of what had just happened. Big Shaq exhaled, rolling his shoulders as if shaking off the last remnants of the fight. He reached for a napkin, wiping the blood off his knuckles, then leaned back in his booth as if nothing had happened. The waitress, still in shock, hesitated before placing a fresh plate of steak in front of him. On the house, she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. Shaq nodded, picking up his fork, but his eyes flickered toward the window. The road outside was empty now, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. The Hellhounds weren't the kind of gang to take a loss lightly. Razor had already made that clear. They had underestimated Shaq once, and now their pride was in pieces, just like the broken furniture around the diner. If there was one thing men like Razor couldn't stand, it was humiliation. Shaq knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Get ready. We're coming. Shaq stared at the message for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, he set the phone down and took another bite of his steak. If the Hellhounds wanted a war, they'd get one. But it wouldn't be on their terms. It would be on his. Big Shaq in 2025, a lesson in power and control. The world in 2025 isn't just about physical battles. It's about standing firm in a world that constantly tests you. Big Shaq's fight at Rosie's diner wasn't just about throwing punches. It was about respect, knowing when to stand up and when to strike back. In today's world, the challenges we face aren't always gangs and fistfights. They come in different forms. Workplace power struggles, online harassment, personal betrayals. The lesson remains the same. When someone tries to intimidate you, do you back down or do you rise? Shaq could have chosen the easy way out, could have ignored Razor and his crew, let them walk all over him. Instead, he made a choice, to demand respect, to fight for his space, to remind the world that not all battles are won with words alone. This is what 2025 needs. Strength, resilience, and the ability to fight back. Not just with fists, but with unshakable confidence. Big Shaq's battle wasn't just about survival. It was about setting the tone for the kind of man he refuses to let the world turn him into. What's next for Big Shaq? The Hellhounds aren't done. They're regrouping, coming back stronger, angrier. But this time, Shaq won't be waiting for them to bring the fight to his doorstep. Should he strike first? Should he let them come and finish what they started? Or is it time for Shaq to disappear before the storm gets worse? Drop a comment. What should Big Shaq's next move be? Should he prepare for war? Or should he walk away knowing he already won?